this is Indonesia. You see there are a lot of islands and everything else. But some key things that I want to highlight. We have over 275 million people, fourth globally after India, China, and the US. Over half of them live in the island of Java, this island right here. Um, yeah, so that is also where Jakarta is located, or most major cities in Indonesia are located. So it has around 17,000 islands, give or take, over 5,000 kilometer. That's the distance between Tehran and London, as a fun fact, and it straddles the equator. So it's the largest Muslim majority nation because more than 85% of its population are Muslim, but it is constitutionally secular. It recognizes six official religions: Islam, Protestantism, Catholicism, apologies for the typo over here, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Confucianism. Other religions are not recognized by the state, and many people with folk beliefs are forced to claim they belong to any of the organized religion because in your ID card you are asked, and it mentions what religion do you subscribe to. So therefore, you have to have an answer, and that's why most people would just like fake it. Either they say that, oh, I'm a Muslim or things like that, because any other religion is not recognized. And recognition of religion is quite important because it also denotes like public holidays. Because Indonesia has a lot of public holidays, especially related to religion, that most other countries wouldn't even have. And the most famous definitely being Eid al-Fitri, sorry, which is the biggest Eid celebration after Ramadan, like the major Eid as we call it. And usually like the entire country would have some sort of like extra long holiday. And even then, for other religions, since they are recognized formally by the state, um, their major holidays are also recognized as public holidays. But fun fact is that Buddhism, Confucianism, which is technically not religion, but rather a philosophy, right? In this case, and Hinduism were also forced to create a monotheistic figure or deity, and therefore are different from common branches of Buddhism and Hinduism. This is because the first pillar of Indonesia is belief in the oneness of God. So the majority of the Hindu people live in the island of Bali, but then they also believe in the concept of one God because when Indonesia was created, their first philosophy was that everyone believed in one God. So that's why that even traditionally polytheistic religions had to create um, a single deity that they worship in order for them to qualify as a recognized religion. Indonesia also controls key shipping lanes, the Strait of Malacca, which is a bridge between Asia and Australia and the Indian and Pacific Oceans. So additional details is that Indonesia is the only ASEAN member of the G20, and they just recently joined BRICS in January 2025. And they're often seen as a natural leader, whatever that means, or heavyweight within ASEAN due to its size, both in terms of like land size and also population and their diplomatic influence in the region. It's the largest democracy in the Muslim world and the third largest democracy overall. Its transition from authoritarianism, which we will cover a little bit later, signaled by the fall of the dictator Suharto in 1998, is a significant case study, despite facing challenges in its democratic processes, as we're going to cover later as well. It has a super large domestic market. It has rich natural resources and growing middle class, though they are facing pressures like sandwich generation. And then we're going to cover the labor condition as well to give like a little bit of more context about their productivity and everything else. So, another fun fact, I guess not so fun, was that Indonesia was colonized first by the Portuguese, the British, the Dutch twice because they did not acknowledge our declared independence in 1945. So they returned right after that and eventually left in 1949, so close to the 50s technically, and then the Japanese. So the agenda for today is that I'm going to cover the brief history of Indonesia, the current political landscape, and its economic condition. So part one, brief history. So the pre-colonial era was marked by kingdoms. So Indonesia housed major kingdoms um, during those years. So the biggest one is the Sriwijaya kingdom, based in in the island of Sumatra, where I came from, during that period. So spanning almost 700 years. And then the Kingdom Majapahit, based in Java. from the 14th to the 15th century. So they conquered with mostly Hindu and Buddhist influences. That's why that we had a lot of Buddhist and Hinduism and Hindu influences in Indonesia, especially in the islands of Bali, and then in many parts of the country, you can see so many remnants left by these kingdoms. And then if you've been to Indonesia, then one of the most, I would say, prominent landmarks is Candi Borobudur or the Borobudur Temple um, as part of those era. So, and then the colonial era came, but I did mention that Portuguese came first, but it was not that substantial compared to what the Dutch did. So at that time, the Dutch came in, and initially was the VOC or the Dutch East Indies Company, initially focused on spice trade monopoly. Later, the Dutch state took direct control in the 19th century. So they did quite a lot because Indonesia, as you can see, that we have a lot of islands, so it was very, very decentralized. So they took some initiatives to impose administrative unity. They exploited the resources, the cultivation system, which forced farmers and peasants to grow crops that they can take back and they can sell to other nations. They create infrastructure, ports, railways, etc., and a lot of like existing infrastructures were remnants of the Dutch colonial era for the extraction and distribution purposes. But then in the early 20th century, there were like rising nationalist movement. And actually, like many Indonesian laws are remnants of the Dutch colonial era, and many of Indonesian words are loan words from the Dutch. So, funnily, what the Dutch did to us in 350 years was nothing compared to what the Japanese did in just 3.5 years, because the Japanese came in 1942, kicked out the Dutch, and then left in 1945 after the end of World War II. So, post-independence era in 1940s to 1960s, so Indonesia declared its official independence on August 17, 1945, right after the Japanese surrendered after World War II. And then at that time, the independence movements were very sporadic because there are 17,000 islands until Sukarno led the efforts of unity and became the first ever president of the nation. So as tension rose between the West and the communists in the 60s, right, Sukarno established the non-aligned movement and hosted a conference held in the city of Bandung in 1955. However, in late 50s, Sukarno ended up concentrating most of the power and resulted in the dissolution of the parliament that he made. He made that decision, which caused like massive problem like hyperinflation and a lot of like economic problems, which happened during the time that the Indonesian Communist Party or the PKI rose into prominence. And there were also like allegations that Sukarno started aligning with the Communist Party at a time. I don't think it was ever proven. But the military, who was backed by the West and led by Soeharto, a general, was not happy with the growing communist influence and decided to take actions after that. So that's why then what we call as the New Order, Sukarno's or like era of presidency was known as the Old Order, and then for Suharto's presidency, we know it as the New Order from the 60s until the 90s after he got deposed. But on September 30th, 1965, there was a coup orchestrated by the Communist Party. It led to, as you can read here, like a brutal anti-communist massacres. Low estimates say that at least 500,000 people who were thought to be communist or associated with them were murdered. And unsurprisingly, many people who were family members or of victims who were taught to be communists are stateless in a way that because of their family association, they they couldn't bring themselves to like report their existence to the government because it might be traced that they are part communist. And then as part of the constitution, communism is illegal in Indonesia. So any discussion related to communism, any discussion related to it, not just discussion, sorry, any sort of like movements related to it, were are seen as complete dissidents in a way that, it's illegal. So you know what happens. So there's like a complete ban of talking about communism in public. So yeah. So, history teachers taught us that Sukarno wrote a letter to confirm that, oh, I'm stepping down, and gave power to Suharto in 1968, but no one really knew what happened, as there was an allegation that Suharto himself made Sukarno wrote the letter. Suharto's rule was highly centralized. It was an authoritarian regime. The military played dominant socio-political role, as they had a dual function, is that the function of them being the military, but also like being part of the governance. So the founding principles and foundations of the nation, what we call as Pancasila, was used as a way to suppress dissent in a way that the military is holding up these principles that we are using, that were used to found the country. Indonesia had a stable economic growth during that time, which attracted massive foreign investment and even had agricultural self-sufficiency without importing, which is not the case now because we are importing. Despite people know us and would characterize us as an agricultural country, we cannot even meet our demands, even including rice. I think that we import a lot of rice from Thailand. However, it was widely known that it was massive. This should be massive. Apologies. The comma is next to an M. Benefiting family or cronies of the Suharto family. So if you're familiar for, I mean, kind of obviously that you're familiar with the Marcos family, they're almost similar. So it's just like the Marcos family is known to have all of their riches from, and then they escaped the country during the situation and during the protests and everything else. Suharto is almost like a carbon copy of that situation. Suharto also harbored deep resentment towards ethnic Chinese, because of the association with communism. He banned ethnic Chinese in Indonesia from having any Chinese names. No holidays related to Chinese cultural practices like Chinese New Year, or anything else, not recognized at all. No Chinese in the government sector, which obviously pushed the ethnic Chinese in Indonesia to pursue mostly entrepreneurship. So then the Reformation era happened, or the era where we deposed Suharto. So during that year, right, the period of 1997 to 98, there was like massive Asian financial crisis, which devastated Indonesian economy. The rupiah, our currency, plummeted. Our banks collapsed. IMF bailed out with super harsh conditions on us. So there was massive student, not was, were massive student protests demanded Suharto to resign, as the corruption scandals were too big to ignore. It was almost like it's a public secret. He did resign in 1998, but not without casualties. So many students were abducted in the process. Nobody knows what happened to them. Students who were killed by the military during the protests were martyred. Well, one of the generals responsible for the above, the abduction, the silencing, and everything, is none other than our current president. More on this person later. But every Thursday, there's this protest that we call as Aksi Kamisan, or basically um, Thursday action. That's the literal translation, where people are demanding for truth and reconciliation for what happened during that period, where people were gone. And then basically it became like an action, an act to demand justice for every sort of human rights violation that happened in the country. However, back to this, during that time, there were mass riots and unrest. Many people, the average Indonesians, would blame the Chinese because the Chinese, remember, they were not allowed to hold office in the government, so they decided to be self-sufficient, right? Being a business people, being business people, they could do that. They're allowed to run their own businesses, but at a time that people really wanted to be part of the military, part of the government, because that was the idea of power at the time. So having your own business is mostly a Chinese, an ethnic Chinese thing. Um, because eventually, right, they managed to avoid the crisis in a way because they have their own businesses and they're not reliant on like government services or things like that. This resulted in a mass murder and assault, and trigger warning rape of Chinese Indonesians, that to this day no truth or reconciliation was ever initiated. So there was deep resentment harbored between ethnic Chinese and non-ethnic Chinese. And in some areas, the gap was very apparent, that gated communities are very apparent as well. After Suharto's resignation, his VP at the time, BJ, don't ask me why, but let's call him Habibi, took over. He was mostly known for proceeding with the East Timor referendum. At the time, it was part of Indonesia. We call that East Timor, and now they are Timor-Leste, leading to the country's secession from Indonesia. So he only ruled for a year before being replaced with Abdurrahman Wahid, who was a pluralist. He recognized the ethnic Chinese. He enshrined their rights to bear Chinese names and celebrate cultural holidays. But he was impeached for proposing to abolish the legislature and the Golongan Karya Party. More on this party later because this party is very significant. After Gus Dur was impeached, or Abdurrahman Wahid, we call him Gus Dur, Megawati Sukarno Putri, Sukarno's daughter, Sukarno Putri literally means Sukarno's daughter. She was selected as Gus Dur's or Abdurrahman Wahid's successor. So there was no presidential election at the time until 2004, as presidents were chosen by our House of Representatives. So during the era of election, right, Indonesia moved towards having direct presidential elections in 2004, and it became a cornerstone of the era of multi-party system. Prior to that, there was not a lot of political party. During Suharto's era, only three. One is the Golongan Karya Party or Suharto's party, and then there's the Islam-centered Partai Persatuan Pembangunan or 3Ps, and then the military, which is considered as a political party at the time. So, and then in 2004, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, also a military person, became the first ever person to get into office through an election in 2004. He won again in 2009. And then Joko Widodo became the second ever president to be elected in 2014. He became the first person who does not have any sort of major political or military background. He was a furniture company owner before he got into politics. So his political journey was he started as a mayor of this city in Central Java, and then he got elected to be the governor of Jakarta. So the concept of home state or everything else doesn't apply in Indonesia because Jokowi came from Central Java. That's why he was a mayor in one of the cities there. And then his political party, we will talk about that later as well, knew that this dude is super popular because at the time he made like social media waves and everything else. And then we need to make him the, what do you call it? The governor of Jakarta. And the governor of Jakarta position is often coveted as like, if you ever want to run for president, you have to at least have some sort of connection to the gubernatorial position in the Jakarta, because even though Jakarta is a city, it is a separate province as well because of how big it is. So yeah, in 2024, we elected a new president, Prabowo Subianto, a very much controversial figure. So then let's talk about the political landscape in detail. So the system that we use in Indonesia is that the president possesses what's wrong with English? Possess strong executive powers, but ultimately needs parliamentary support for budgeting, to pass laws, and etc. No single party dominates right now, though they are more prominent than the others. The first one is the Golongan Karya Party, which is a remnant of Suharto's rule. We shorten them as Golkar. So the English for it, Golongan is group, and Karya means like, I don't know how to put this. Karya is like productive. So I don't know, it's just like, or functional. So it's like a functional group party or something like that. I don't know. You can look it up later. I'm not even sure if they have any official English name. And then the next party is the Partai Demokrasi Indonesia Perjuangan, which literally means the Indonesia Democratic Struggle Party. And it is Megawati's party, considered as the spiritual successor of Sukarno's spirit. And then the Gerakan Indonesia Raya, or the Great Indonesia Movement Party, very similar to a certain tagline that a certain president of a certain country has, which is Prabowo's party. And then we have the Democratic Party, which is the Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's, our first ever elected president's party. And then there's this Partai Keadilan Sejahtera, or Keadilan is justice, Sejahtera is welfare. So yeah, justice, just welfare party, I don't know. A party that is mostly founded based on Islamic values. Coalitions are very fluid in Indonesia, that they can really change at any single point. The structure of the legislature is quite straightforward. 580 members directly elected to the House of Representatives, known as the DPR. and then 552 members of DPD, or the Regional Representative Council, which has less power, no legislative power, and as they focus more on regional issues, if you ask me in detail, I don't even know what they're doing. They're also elected technically. But yeah, and then collectively, they are known as the MPR, or the Congress, right? Basically, which mainly deals with issues like inauguration, impeachment, and also constitutional amendments. And Indonesia has a national pillar, or like the founding principles, called Pancasila, which has five tenets. One, belief in one God. Number two, just humanity. Haha. Three, unity of Indonesia. Also, haha, because it is the most widely used tenet to suppress any some sort of like movements, or any sort of like anything that can be considered as a threat to the unity of Indonesia. We can talk about Papua a little bit later. And then four is the most, I would say, I don't even know what it means. Democracy guided by inner wisdom. And it's actually longer than this, but I never know what it means. But it's just basically like the concept of us trusting the decisions made by the people that we elect, something like that. Doesn't make sense. Yeah, I know. And then social justice for all Indonesians. This one is not just overlook. I think this is just like, I don't know, social justice for all Indonesians. Um, I think they're doing a great job in that department. The key powers, presidency, center of executive power, the parliament or the DPR, crucial for lawmaking and budget approval, and then the Constitutional Court or MK. They gain prominence post Reformation, or the era where we deposed Soeharto. Rules on election disputes, they review constitutionality of laws. Its impartiality has been questioned recently because Gibran, the vice president of Prabowo, is Jokowi's son. And at the time, he did not meet the qualification because he did not meet the age requirements. He's not 40. Minimum was 40 to be run as a vice president. But many believe that the Constitutional Court passed the ruling as one of the justices is Jokowi's brother-in-law. So they overturned that. So no need to be minimum 40 anymore. But then one of the justices was Jokowi's brother-in-law. And no matter how much he said that he is not involved in the process, but you know, yeah. Jokowi's legacy and influence, he's very popular, maintained exceptionally high approval rating, often 70 to 80% throughout his second term, which was the dark days of COVID mostly because he was elected in 2019. Then the year after that, we had COVID, right? Despite the economic downturn, despite the super bad handling of lockdowns and every other policy, even the Ministry of Health was just like lame AF. But he still maintained high approval ratings because of his ability to maintain his social image. At that time, his focus was creating infrastructure projects, toll roads, airports, and ports, attracting massive investment, moving the capital city from Jakarta to what we call as Nusantara in the island of Borneo or Kalimantan. He's a little bit pragmatic, less focused on ideology. But then again, if you ask the average Indonesian, you never know what is the ideology being represented by Indonesian parties. You never know because, like I said, the coalition is very fluid. So it's just like super weird that you cannot, if you ask the average Indonesian students, university students, they probably don't even know like the basis of ideology because we don't really learn politics. We don't really learn about those things, even in civic studies. Yeah. So, but anyway, so his implicit and therefore Gibran's presence is quite explicit in the whole debacle. So basically, it was quite obvious that he was widely seen as one of the reasons that why Prabowo will win because he wanted to latch into Prabowo. Jokowi came from Megawati's party, the PDIP, the Partai Demokrasi Indonesia Perjuangan. But then he moved away from that. He is cutting things off because PDIP was in opposition during the last election. So that's why he put his son as Prabowo's vice president. So it raised a lot of questions about neutrality of state apparatus during campaign. And then the 2024 election, Prabowo won decisively in first round, avoiding a runoff. Third time running for president, he lost to Jokowi twice in 2014, 2019. He was the Minister of Defense in 2019, appointed by Jokowi himself. See, showing that how things can be quite interesting. But anyway, um, there were two other candidates, but if we talk about that, I'm just going to uncover a lot of more other things, and I don't think that we can cover every single thing. So that's why we're just going to focus on the basics. So the background of Prabowo, he's the ex-son-in-law of Suharto, the former commander of what we call as Kopassus or Komandan Pasukan Khusus or Special Forces. And the past human rights allegations of like the abduction, and also like involved in the anti-communist propaganda in the 60s. He serves as Jokowi's defense minister, as I mentioned, campaigned heavily on continuity with popular Jokowi policies. So he was like a super anti-Jokowi in from 2014 to 2019, and then he became the minister of defense, and then now he's like Jokowi's closest ally, which is pretty interesting. And then the vice president, Gibran, which is Jokowi's eldest son, mayor of Solo. Solo is the city that Jokowi was the mayor of before he became the governor of Jakarta. So his candidacy enabled by the ruling that we covered earlier, seen as key to attracting Jokowi supporters to support Prabowo. So then the Prabowo's Gerindra party leads the Indonesia Maju coalition, including major parties like Golkar and Demokrat. So controversies during his presidency so far, it's been just a couple of months. So the VP ruling context, obviously, right? So this is already a controversy even before the election. And then he, on trends observed under late Jokowi presidency, concerns about the use of defamation laws, which is a product of Jokowi's era, where basically that they make laws about defamation law that anything that you say online, especially that can be considered as critics to the government, you might be, you know, yeah. So then the anti-corruption body is also weakening at a time, and the passage of controversial job creation law, which is also something that we might cover a little bit later with limited consultation. So Prabowo's past record and rhetoric fuel these concerns about he is not going to be a good president by you know some people perspective, but eventually he won the elections anyway. But then when it comes to like his post-election controversy, there are three things that I want to highlight here. Number one is the dual function context of military, because under Suharto, military officers held positions through bureaucracy, state enterprises, parliament, every single thing. So the Reformation era, or the era that he got deposed of, aimed to professionalize military and remove it from politics altogether. But this law was revised in 2025, known as the TNI law. TNI is the Indonesian Military Forces, where it increased number of civilian posts open to active officers from 10 to 15 per reports, broadened definitions related to national security roles. And it was very vague. It can potentially include positions like attorney general or even board positions for state-owned enterprises, which brings back people's trauma from Suharto's era. But the worst part is that the process of passing this law through the House of Parliamentary to the House of Representatives was limited. Usually that the usual process is that when the House of Representatives are meeting, it's publicly available, right? But not this one. They decided to have a meeting in a five-star hotel in a weekend. And people find out about that when there was an activist group that were able to trace how that happened. And then it was not quite, it was like a bad move because they were cutting a lot of budget in a lot of departments. And for some reason, they managed to book a five-star hotel and then have meetings there for, I don't know, a couple of days during the weekend. Usually prices spike, right? And yeah, so why would they have meetings in secret? And then I think spokesperson, is it the spokesperson of the president? I forgot, mentioned about, yeah, we did that so it will be like fast. So they would rather pass decisions fast without people knowing. And they know that people are concerned about this loss, but they still do it anyway. So yeah. And then the second project that I want to highlight, or the controversy, is the Makan Bergizi Gratis, literally basically a free lunch for all school students. So initially it's a project created to deal with stunting, but many have reported the national budget is strained too much, which is true, as many efficiency and budget cuts that I mentioned in other departments were done. So there were reports about spoiled food, uncooked food, raw food, basically resulting in food poisoning in some rural areas. So not only that they took up so much budget, the execution was poor. Nothing new in Indonesia. And then lastly, the controversy that people are protesting about is the establishment of the sovereign wealth fund. They name it Danantara, basically the Temasek of Indonesia. Doubled down by the appointment of controversial individuals as advisors. So Thaksin Shinawatra, the deposed PM of Thailand, is chosen to be one of the advisors. Yeah, you know that he got deposed because of allegations for corruption and abuse of power. And then the ongoing political issues that we are facing right now, significant demonstrations and protests, primarily led by students and civil society in Jakarta and other major university cities. So the protest in Indonesia was largely driven by student groups. So the demands are focused on repealing or reviewing the 10E law revision. There are also protests about the Danantara and also protests about the free lunch program because of how much they're taking a lot of budget to the point that they're cutting from other departments as well. So the concerns that people have mostly was explicitly linked to the law of the 10E law that may bring back the trauma of like military having dual function in society, and then erosion of civilian control and threat, which became a threat to hard-won democratic freedoms in 1998, right? And then Prabowo's reaction, he dismissed every single concerns. He said that this dual function as nonsense in media interviews, instead backing that the military is needed in certain roles. Obviously, his response is criticized by groups like Amnesty International because very dismissive, right? And then obviously during the protests, police brutality, nothing new, sadly applies to Indonesia too. Concerns moving forward, the corruption index in Indonesia is often stagnates or slightly declines. KPK or the Anti-Corruption Commission still prosecutes cases, but systemic corruption remains a major issue, especially of how decentralized Indonesia is because each region has governor, and then we also have like um whatever, right, mayors or something like that. So then it's a little bit um I would say almost expected that corruptions cases are like deeply rooted in Indonesia. And then identity politics, balancing the national unity concept, the Pancasila that I mentioned, with demands from conservative Islamic groups related to blasphemy law. I think that related to this, remember that there's this governor candidate in Indonesia back in when was that? I forgot, 2019, 2017. I don't recall, I'm sorry. But yeah, he got into prison for saying something about Islam. And it was not even that controversial, but he was basically saying just like, do not let. So his statement, and he's an ethnic Chinese, by the way. So he said, basically, do not let your holy text, well, referring to the Quran, fool you, or not fool you, but rather like influence your decision, or basically don't be uncritical towards these things. So it's not a direct insult, but it can be interpreted as such. And because of the defamation law or the blasphemy law specifically, that he got imprisoned for, basically being blasphemous towards Islam for saying that, oh, the holy book is therefore, what are you saying that the holy book is used to fool us and everything else? So then, yeah. Um, Quite a controversial situation, not quite a lot. And then the alcohol regulations in Indonesia, if you usually go to like bars in big cities like Jakarta, let's say during Ramadan, you wouldn't find any alcohol because yeah, for some reason. But then there are still places that do that, but anyway. Um, the influence of Islam in education is pretty huge. Um, Yeah, regional identities, autonomy, demands, which flares up during election, and then the human rights concern about Papua. The region remains very, very sensitive because the issues include historical grievances, resource exploitation. Prabowo's security background puts his approach here under scrutiny because he would prioritize like military deployment to deal with the protests or any sort of movement there. So the concerns are more like questions about how will Prabowo balance campaign promises in terms of continuity, populist programs like the free lunch thing with fiscal realities and demands from his diverse coalition partners and his own policy priorities. Let's talk about the economic condition. So this is just to give you like overview of how big Indonesia is in terms of like economy. So the total GDP, not per capita, obviously, reached 1.37 trillion USD in 2023. They aim for 1.4 trillion plus. So their dominant economy, they are a dominant economy in ASEAN, roughly 35 to 40% of the region's GDP. And then their income status is classified as upper middle income, but the key challenge is avoiding the income trap, basically. So the key economic indicators and projections, the GDP growth often cited target as 5%, was 5.05 in 2023. The projections for 2024 to 2025 are, yeah, around that number. But recent shocks might revise this down, which we are going to talk about after this. So there is a stock market crash in Indonesia because of the protests and the questionable policies. The inflation, the Bank Indonesia or the Central Bank of Indonesia, their target range is 2.5% plus, give or take like 1%, i.e. around 1.5 to 3.5% for 2024 to 2025, but recent figures are around 3%. So the inflation rate is very sensitive to global energy and food prices because of how much demand that the Indonesians are asking, and rupiah value as well, because the rupiah value is very fluctuative, especially because that we also do a lot of imports, including, like I mentioned at the beginning, for our own food. The unemployment rate in Indonesia is roughly 5.3%. And this is the number per August 2024. But high underemployment and informal sector work because 60% of workforce is informal. And then the poverty, the official rate is 9.4%. They're slow downward throughout the years, but remain persistent. The income inequality is pretty high, basically. In terms of major economic sectors, services sector, 40% of GDP, mostly from trading, transportation, telecommunication, finance, and hospitality. We have large domestic consumption base. And then in terms of the industry, like the industrial sector, 40%, manufacturing, especially textiles, automotive, electronics, food processing, mining. Coal is a major export. That's why that we're buddy-buddy with China. And then nickel, which is critical for EVs, also why we're starting to buddy-buddy with China. Also tin, copper, gold, and bauxite. Bauxite? I don't know, English. And then construction. And then another sector is then agriculture. They employ 30% of our workforce. We are a major palm oil exporter, largest producer, by the way. And then rice, our staple crop, which is weird because we are not even able to fulfill our own rice demands. And then rubber, coffee, cocoa, spices. For the digital economy, it's largely growing, often seen as the tech hub of Southeast Asia. Well, Singapore is like the main headquarter, but when it comes to like growth of technology sector, Indonesia is usually like one of the often most cited country in the region. E-commerce, ride hailing, financial technology. The key players is Goto, or the Gojek and Tokopedia merger. And then we have Grab as well, Shopee, Traveloka, even though like Grab and Shopee are Singaporean, but they have large consumer base in Indonesia. And then the priorities of the economy right now is just to continue Jokowi's push, establish more roads, ports, airports, especially like creating this high rail between Jakarta and Bandung, one of the biggest city in Indonesia, but it's also like a very big student, like a university city. And then also on energy infrastructure. And then downstream processing. So they ban raw mineral exports, nickel ore since 2020, for example, to force investment in domestic smelters or processing. So the goal is to capture more value, create more jobs, build EV supply chain attractive. They did attract massive Chinese investment in nickel smelters, but losing big time to Vietnam. I think I will mention somewhere about, especially when it comes to like manufacturing. Indonesia tried to bid for Nvidia's investment, lost to Vietnam, tried to bid for Apple's investment. I think Apple had confirmed, but not really. But eventually they built manufacturing hub in Vietnam, right? So Vietnam is really like the hub for, you know, investment, especially for manufacturing companies. And Indonesia is crying at the background, no matter how much they're trying. And then in terms of like the situation for investment. So the Omnibus Law on Job Creation 2020 aimed to simplify regulations and licensing that it basically made foreign investors easier to come, including in the way that they manage their contracts with their employees. I think there were like some revisions that allow easier employment for short-term employees, and then companies would just do that and abuse that. So that's why there were concerns and there were massive protests around that time as well, which make labor laws a lot flexible and obviously perceived as not on the side of the people or the laborers. So yeah, it was very controversial among unions and environmental groups because it makes it very easy for employers to fire people and or hire people with short-term contracts, which creates an issue in sustainability. And then the new capital, Nusantara, we call it IKN or Ibu Kota Nusantara, Ibu Kota Negara, I don't know. But yeah, so it's a new capital city in East Kalimantan or Borneo, initially as a symbol of shifting development focus beyond Java. Because remember that Java is the most populated island in Indonesia, and that's where people see, people perceive that most economic opportunities are there. So now they are trying to move away from that perspective to show that, hey, we're not only focusing on Java, we're focusing on like other parts of Indonesia as well. So the phase one target, the core area, were quite ambitious in a way that it was unfinished, and then getting the funding it remains a challenge. Prabowo said he is committed to continue it, but then it is estimated to require 39.1 trillion rupiah, more than 2 billion USD for completion. So good luck finding investors. Yeah, and then opportunities of Indonesia as an economy is that the 70% of population is working age, potential dividend in a way that, returns if they are educated, healthy, and employed productively, a huge if, and then large consumer base. So resources, we already covered this, and a domestic market, large internal demand can buffer up against global slowdown. So that's why that maybe that's the reason that why Indonesia politicians are very nonchalant in a way that we have a lot of people, so they're just gonna like rely on that. So yeah, high internet, smartphone penetration is developing, potential for digital services growth. I think that fintech company is growing because they really try to tap into the unbanked as well. And then again, their location is very strategic for regional trade, manufacturing hubs, like I mentioned, losing out big time to Vietnam, unfortunately. And then the challenges that we are facing right now is that number one, inequality. The Gini coefficient is 0.38, which signifies high income inequality, especially development gaps between like Western Indonesia, the islands of Java, the islands of Sumatra. Sumatra was benefited because they are technically like where Strait of Malacca is located. So they are indeed like majorly developed because of their strategic location as ports. But then Java is where the capitals are, where the big cities are. So that's why people consider that as the main economic hub. But then when you take a look at least Eastern Indonesia, especially Papua, and Nusa Tenggara Timur, which borders with East Timor, is yeah, they're left behind. Massive like inequality between these areas. And then the bureaucracy, despite reforms, is very slow, very complex, prone to corruption at local levels. And I think at this point that everyone knows, especially if you are an Indonesian who have to go through every single bureaucratic process. You still have to bring like physical copies of things whenever you want to apply for things. It's just basically like very inefficient. And then infrastructure gaps still persist, especially in logistics, reliability of energy. Many major areas are going to experience like blackouts or things like that because the energy production is not able to meet the demand. Internet access outside major cities or Java, outside of Java, is still very limited. And as you can see, as you can imagine, there's high logistic costs, right? Because you need to use the sea and then the road and then the land transportation is also like it stretches so long. So yeah. And then next challenge is that the commodity dependence. Our economy is still heavily reliant on raw or semi-processed commodity exports, very vulnerable to global price swings. For example, the coal price volatility. And then the environment issue, Indonesia is a major global player in deforestation despite having a lot of forest because, the expansion of palm oil production, crude palm oil production, mining, or pulp and paper as well. significant reliance on coal for electricity, 60%. And this is super bad because they have like this power plant in a way that is very close to Jakarta that really make Jakarta full of smog to the point that there was at least concerns about, not concerns, like actual children getting sick and having like respiratory infection because of how close the power plant, which is using coal. So it's pretty bad. And then obviously skills gap in a way that the educational outcomes often lack regional peers, again, because of the centralization in Java and not in like other areas. So there's a shortage of skilled workers, especially when it comes to like higher value added industries, right? And then investor confidence is also like waning, especially because of the recent challenge that I mentioned. They really need to rebuild trust, demonstrate fiscal prudence while delivering on promises. And hopefully they can do that. So they are nervous mostly because of three things. One, the fiscal strain, right? Can the state budget handle large populist programs such as the free lunch program, 30 billion USD per year, without widening the deficit beyond the legal limit that is required by Indonesian law, which is 3% of the GDP? Or yeah, they're going to cut other essential spending, which they have. And then the reports of falling tax revenue in 2025 exacerbated this. So that means that people just do not declare taxes, and I wonder why, right? Because of the distrust and the fact that the corruptions are just widely known. And then the Sovereign Wealth Fund, the Danantara Fund, concerns about its governance, transparency, potential for corruption, given that it is directly reporting to the president. And then it plans control over major state banks and SOEs as well. So many conflict of interest, appointment of controversial figures in the advisory board. So I think it's rightfully so that people are skeptical about this. And then the concerns on political risk, the military law, as potentially destabilizing or signaling that they are moving away from democratic norms that obviously international investors prefer. But yeah, that happens. The recent shocks, rupiah dropped significantly, a record low, even lower than, when it had during the Asian financial crisis. Obviously, like, different contexts. But which are created by the way that our currency drop is because it's driven by strong USD globally. Weird. But exacerbated by domestic concerns like we have just covered as well. And then the Jakarta Composite Index, or basically like the stock market, right? Indicated the index. It fell hard to the point that there's a 30-minute halt in trading. So it was down significantly from year to date 2025, reflecting the nervousness that we just covered as well. And then the sentiment was obviously like, clearly impacted by the confluence of factors like funding doubts for Prabowo's program, concerns about the governance, global factors like joining BRICS, moving away from the US. So, but anyway, the US is moving away from everyone anyway. But yeah, anyway. Cool. So the conclusion is the key things that people are observing now, the clarity on Prabowo's economic team and fiscal strategy, implementation of major programs like Nusantara, the Downstream Project, the Freelance Project, the Danantara Sovereign Wealth Fund Project, his approach to democratic institutions, civil liberties, and human rights, especially Papua, and the management of his political coalition and potential opposition because of how fickle Indonesian coalition can be. So yeah, cool. So that's pretty much it. So I hope that it's helpful to give you a little bit of more nuanced and context to Indonesia. So thank you so much for listening, watching, and I'm glad to help in any way. But yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.